Welcome to Geoversity and our first video podcast. I'm Brad Hillas, the editor of Geoversity. In this episode, I speak to Professor Monika Kuffer of the ITC faculty at University of Twente about her work in urban planning and urban geography and how it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The SDGs were established by the United Nations in 2015 to protect the planet, end poverty, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by the year 2030. The SDGs are made up of 17 objectives, and they include things like quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, and decent work and economic growth. Each goal has specific measures and indicators to track progress, though many of them are interlinked. Monika Kuffer's work contributes to many of these areas. She uses geospatial information to monitor deprived areas, or slums, in order to support decision-making and planning in these areas. I'm curious to learn more about how her work contributes to the achievement of inclusive, livable, and sustainable cities. Monika, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Monika, today we want to talk about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and how they relate to ITC projects, specifically the projects that you've been working on. Maybe you could tell us some of the specific SDGs that relate to the kind of work that you're doing at the moment.
Let's say I'm working across several SDGs, but obviously because I'm coming very much from urban geography, urban planning, so the SDG 11, the urban SDG, is obviously the main focal SDG, but very much also relating to the work we do around spatial inequalities, which relate to SDG 1 on poverty, or SDG 7 about energy access, which is in many countries I'm working. A big issue that even in urban areas, people don't have access to electricity or reliable electricity. SDG 13 on climate change plays a critical role, and they're all sort of interlinked. When you talk in general about spatial inequalities in urban regions.
Yeah, you mentioned SDG 11, which is very relevant for work in the urban sphere. So this SDG states the goal of making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Can you tell us what those terms mean to you in the context of your work?
So it means to me that all citizens should benefit from the goods of what urban spaces offer, which means access to services, meaning, for example, access to education, healthcare, to have, let's say, a house, a shelter that protects you against the environment, to have access to decent employment. So all the goods why we enjoy urban spaces, also the amenities of urban spaces, to have recreational spaces, green areas to engage with each other. So basically the sort of values of an urban space. And particularly in the global south, you see this massive inequalities. Like, for example, like if you take the city of Nairobi, you have 60% of its inhabitants living in areas you call like slums, informal settlements, very deprived living conditions, very congested. People don't have access to basic services like wash, meaning water and sanitation, housing quality issues, but also are exposed very frequent to hazards. And this 60% in Nairobi live on 4% of the build-up area, which means an extreme density, no spaces, no green spaces in between. Also, when you look to health outcomes, you see massive gaps in life expectancies. Like if you go like within few hundred meters, you have life expectancy differences of up to 20 years, meaning a person living in one of the slums in Nairobi will, in average, maybe die around 50, and in a planned urban area, maybe 70.
Right.
And that's within maybe 200-meter distance.
Right. And this is why geospatial data is so important, so you can understand these relationships. So we've talked about SDG 11, but you also mentioned your work touches on some of the other SDGs. Do you find in sort of pursuing these SDGs, so to speak, you come into conflict with any of the others because they're sort of neatly packaged into these aims, but they actually cover like quite a disparate set of aims and outputs. So do you find that you encounter any sort of conflicts between them?
An example of a situation which really bothers me, and that's sort of the conflict between SDG 11 and SDG 13 about climate change. Let's say there was a recent massive flood in Nairobi, so it impacted large parts of Kenya, and particularly the very densely built up areas in Nairobi, where a lot of people were losing their home, but also a lot of lives have been lost. So people have been washed away. And as a reaction, the national government decided to clean up all the areas along the rivers, which was done within a very harsh way. So basically what happened is that people had, in the best case, a warning of 48 hours that their houses will be demolished and that bulldozers come to their houses. So often people didn't have even the time to pack everything, to reorganize their life. So what happened is the whole area developed into like a refugee camp where people are sitting and sleeping on streets, families, kids, after their houses were bulldozed. And we are talking about a total of 200,000 people impacted by this measurement of cleaning the houses along the riverbeds. They're relatively if you look to images, maybe they seem to be relative small areas, but because of the high densities, there's a massive amount of people impacted by this measure. People don't know where to go. The housing market has been increasing, so the rents doubled in these settlements after this happened because of the massive demand of housing, and people don't have the ability to pay these high rents. And this was done under the context, of course, let's say, to prevent future floods happening. Yep. Because what happened is that also the formal areas got massive flooded, big, nice, expensive houses. And therefore this action was made to gain sort of spaces for a next flood, that it's not impacting all the infrastructure in the formal parts of the city. But there was no engagement with citizens, with community groups about how to do this in a more just way.
Yeah.
And that's what you see, the conflict between dealing with the impacts and developing adaptation measurements on climate change, poverty, and urban development.
Yeah.
And it's often done on the back of the poorest.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a lot of challenges. I wanted to talk about some of the challenges and also some of the things that you've been more encouraged by. So maybe we can start with the challenges. What kind of uncertainties and issues do you encounter when you're trying to pursue these SDGs in your work? Maybe you can give us a specific example from one of your projects.
So one of the uncertainties already starts with population data. So many SDGs relate to the population. So number of people living in slums, informal settlements, inadequate housing. So the question is of course, on one hand, you want to understand the area. For example, taking the example of slums or informal settlements, so the extent, the location of those areas. But then you need to combine it with population data. And the problem with population data is that often, let's say you have in many countries, the last census maybe dates back to 30 years ago. And you have the situation that the population estimates of such areas are typically totally wrong. So we made experiments in several cities and we saw that often at best global population data set capture maybe 30% or less of the people living in such areas. A very famous example is Dharavi in India, one of the famous slums in Mumbai, where you have a population, an estimate population of about 1 million people in around 2 square kilometers. So that's the density, which is an unimaginable density from a European perspective. And if you overlay some of the population data sets, global population models, in some of the models you get 50,000 people living in a space where local estimates assume 1 million.
Yeah, that's quite a gap.
That's the sort of the gaps and the discrepancy between the reality and the models.
All right. So you've definitely set out some of the challenges and uncertainties. Maybe you could talk a little bit about any developments that you've seen that you're more encouraged by.
At least on the data side, a development is from an Earth observation perspective, is that in collaboration with Geoinhabitat, we are in the moment working on Earth observation-based methods that would support SDG monitoring, which would bring down finally the SDG indicators to cities, because they're often country-level aggregates, which don't allow us to see the spatial diversity within countries, which is fundamental, particularly if you go to voluntary local reviews, which are either regional or city-level SDG reports that look into at city scale or at the region scale, how is the progress of SDGs. And their spatial data and disaggregated data are typically key for the reporting. I've been building together with a large group led by Geoinhabitat, with colleagues from NASA, from the European Commission, etc., an SDG 11 toolkit to make Earth observation data more accessible to city stakeholders and to also national stakeholders, also to NGOs, to make SDG reporting using Earth observation data more accessible, because people always sometimes sort of dive or swim in a massive ocean of data, and it's very difficult to understand which data set is relevant for what SDG. So we have been compiling all kinds of data sets that relate to urban SDGs, documented them, providing guidance documents on how to use them for SDG reporting. And I think that's something which really needs to move on, to make Earth observation data more accessible to people, to users, where this data would be actually relevant and better in reporting.
You talked a little bit about going back to geospatial data. One of the issues is to make it more relevant for some of these areas. Could you give us another example of where there are sort of shortcomings in using geospatial data?
So if you look into any global data set, be it, for example, like a data set which we all researchers often use, is, for example, OpenStreetMap.
OpenStreetMap is built by citizens, is that right?
Yes, it's built by citizens.
Yeah.
So it's in most global models, this data set is used. But if you then go to a local scale, and I made just like, it was not even intended as an experiment about OpenStreetMap. It was teaching citizens to work with very simple map applications. We made like a very simple exercise. So it's an app, and I sent them out, have a look, and please map all the bathrooms, the toilets, which are public toilets in most areas, so people don't have their private toilet. But then when we compared the map toilet with what is available on OpenStreetMap, we saw that the data on OpenStreetMap, they're just like totally wrong. And the reason why they're totally wrong is that they are dated. So having data updated in OpenStreetMap is often, particularly in such areas, in informal settlement slums, is often a big issue.
How out of date is this data exactly from OpenStreetMap?
Of course, that's not a global assessment. In this area, let's say with the local knowledge of the people who are living in the area, so the maps, they were outdated for more than 5 years.
And is it right that these deprived areas tend to change sort of much more quickly than planned settlements? Yeah.
So I was then also thinking, like, because we use all these layers and we use that in our models, so it's really critical to train and to invest also in the capacity of communities to update such maps, because they're often used in a way to assess different deprivation levels and to assess what is actually lacking in such areas. But if we use data which are dated or totally wrong, then we come to a total wrong conclusion of what are the specific needs of communities.
And so data generated by citizens, is that central to your aim of improving the data?
I think it's a combination, because, of course, like if you rely only on citizens generated data, you will not be able to have a global coverage. and particularly in areas which are not easily accessible because of conflicts or other reasons. So the combination of citizens-generated data and models that come and are fed by Earth observation data and using artificial intelligence models, I think the combination is very important to be trained by quality data, because that's often what is happening and what is very disturbing. If you see models that are trained by very incomplete data, incorrect data, insufficient data, and then the output are not at all reflecting the reality.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yes,
right.
right.
Yeah, and also you talked about the need to sort of train citizens in using applications, how to gather data, these kinds of things, which is presumably another layer of cost and resources, etc. Yeah, you mentioned AI as well. Can you tell us a bit about that? How does AI play into generating these kinds of data?
Yeah, our sort of long-term vision is to produce a global repository about deprivation, which is like a layered data set that looks to not only the binary situation, like slum versus non-slum areas, but to have like a layered system of different aspects of deprivation. Deprivation being a multidimensional poverty concept, like lack of something like lack of access to like water sanitation, or contamination of areas like air quality issues, air pollution issues. So we are basically have been developing a conceptual frame for modeling deprivation in global south countries, mainly combining existing open data sets with Earth observation data sets. And there basically the artificial intelligence based model come in, because you don't have a situation like in the UK or the Netherlands where you have very rich statistical data coming from the census or from registration based systems, but you need to find often proxy data sets that come from Earth observation data, be it about very coarse air pollution models, being models about the urban morphology, which describes the urban form, which often is an indicator of housing quality, the sort of the general housing condition, but also the general livability of such spaces.
Right. You mentioned that sometimes there's like disputes about whether an area counts as like deprived or not. Like, do people sort of get offended sometimes if they find themselves being placed in a deprived area, but they don't consider themselves as such? Is that because conflicts?
I think it's that's the reason also why we are using deprivation levels, so the degree of deprivation, that we don't want to label area as a slum, because in many places, if you label an area as a slum, informal, it has a massive stigmatization. Also, like if you produce such a map and this map would be openly available, it even can impact the housing prices in neighboring areas. So therefore, we are somehow shying away from this binary mapping, because it also doesn't do justice to the complexity of areas, because it can have a massive legal consequence. Because if you would label an area as a slum/informal settlement, this might be leading to discussions of an area being evicted. On the positive side, it might lead to discussion of how this area should be improved. So it can have both consequences, and therefore we prefer to map the deprivation and deprivation levels.
That kind of flattens out all of those nuances and differences. Yeah. So going back to the AI models, how do you do the quality control?
So we are basically using standard measurements of accuracy, which is like in the scene, like you have the F1 score. So we are comparing our output with local reference data, but we are struggling with it, to be very clear, because what we are mapping is a much more complex phenomena. It's not like, is there a tree or not? Even on the ground, sometimes people would debate, like if you would have a binary map of slum, non-slum. Even on the ground, sometimes people debate whether this area would be locally called a slum or not.
Mm-hmm.
Besides, in one of the projects, ID Atlas, which runs over, in the moment, 8 cities, we plan to extend. In all cities, we have problems with the reference data, that the reference data are incomplete, dated, very aggregated sometimes. And so we assess our model against, we train our model with them. So typically you put one part of the reference data for the training and another unseen part for assessing the accuracy. And we train to a certain degree with very problematic data, incomplete data, and we assess it against it. Taking now the example, for example, of Buenos Aires in Argentina, it's quite an accurate data set. It's a ground-generated data set from a national slum registry, but they know that's incomplete because they didn't register all communities. So we train the model and we assess the accuracy. So we have a relatively, as an output, had a very relatively low accuracy. So we sent our first model output back to our local partners and asked them for guidance about the areas where we see our model went wrong. And we thought our model was very wrong. So our local partners were very excited about the areas we call false positive in modeling. So areas which have been detected from our model as a potential slum informal settlement, but in the reference data it's not. So what happened is they went to a couple of those areas and they find a lot of new settlements. In this case, it's very positive, the outcome for those communities, because in the moment they're included in this national registry, it means they have a guarantee of 10 years of being not evicted.
Mm-hmm.
So with our first model, we already had like a couple of settlements being added to this registry. But in a moment, let's say what we do is we run in all the cities. So we send our data back. We have workshops and we developed a whole portal about to have user feedback in an organized way, which means that we show on this portal, it's a web-based portal, the mapping output, our model output with the reference data. And we ask them to, in particular in areas of contradiction, to give us guidance. What is actually the reality on this space? Would it be seen locally as a slum informal settlement, or would it be seen as a formal area?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is basically done then by drawing and providing context information on a web-based portal. So we have these cycles, these rounds of improvement.
And then how is it made sort of useful for the communities themselves? Because presumably this is of great interest to decision makers in the area. So how does that take place?
We basically, throughout the whole project, we actively engage stakeholders in the defining of the mapping or the modeling system, in providing intermediate feedbacks about outputs, but also capacitating them in using spatial models. And the stakeholder groups are very diverse. In Idea Atlas, we basically have local, what we call co-anchors in each city, in all our pilot cities, where we basically engage and run workshops, living labs, where we have budget for these activities. Another example is Lagos, because there are continuous evictions going on and very brutal, without any warning time, etc. So we have been very much supporting mapping efforts, because that's what, so the organization we are working together in Lagos is an organization which trains paralegals, meaning that people training citizens to be able to provide legal advices to their communities. The organization is run by lawyers and they are producing evidences for court cases. And maps are often very critical evidences for court cases to show, because the area is gone, so they don't have any records of these areas. While historic satellite images then are, and maps showing the extent, the number of structures which have been evicted, are one way of producing evidences for court cases.
Yeah.
But also we are training, like, let's say, as said, citizens. Like we had also an amazing situation recently in Nairobi. So the government decided that, let's say, the eviction zone is 30 meters on each side of the river. And a lot of people were worried whether the house is in or outside the zone. So we have been training people from those communities to map. So they went now to the field and mapped, and they could document which houses are inside and outside. And particularly for those, and there was one gentleman, and his house is also very close to the river, and he was saying he was so happy that he could map himself and to show and document that his house is not part of the 30-meter zone. He printed the map. If the government comes to his house, he has an evidence showing that he should be not part of the eviction zone. And that's what we are trying to do, is to enable, in this case, citizens to work with geospatial data for what we think is impactful.
And so it's rather than, you generate this map and then make it available to a community, it sounds like the stakeholders are sort of involved, much more heavily involved throughout the data lifecycle process.
Yes, and that's an important, really game changer, because people in particularly poorer communities, they're very irritated about all the researchers hopping by, extracting data but not giving anything back.
Yeah,
because that's a standard practice, and that's something we really want to change, to build data systems together with local users. They are doing it. It's their decision and their data they are now collecting.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're working not just to help improve these areas, but also kind of change the way that such research is done.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so we're going to zoom out quite a bit to more sort of general questions. What's your big dream or wish for your field of study, if you have one?
I have a lot of wishes and dreams. Let's say our first big dream and vision, that's where we all work towards, is the development of what we would call this global repository of deprived urban areas that provides access to data which are basically on high demand for many other application fields, looking into the climate impact, adaptation, measurements, general economic, socioeconomic development of such areas, infrastructure development, name it. So this such a sort of data level would be really crucial to, on a global but particularly on a local space, to define which areas, where should investments go into areas, and how the future of cities can be imagined that reduce this massive existing spatial inequalities.
And so is your idea that this would be the sort of go-to repository for geospatial data for implementing the SDGs as well?
At least the urban SDGs and related SDGs. And making problems more visible, because a lot of the existing challenges are not visible in data sets. Another example of total invisibility is if you talk access to electricity statistics, and you go to the main global repositories, you will find many of the cities shown as 100% of the citizens have access to electricity. Like take a city of Lagos, take a city of Nairobi, most of the African cities. The situation is now people have not access to electricity. Like in the night, you sit in the dark. You have a candle for kids to study. But then also in outdoor spaces, like if you need in the night to leave your house, if you live in areas where there's no street lights, it has a massive safety issue, particularly also for women. Even going to the bathroom after darkness has a sort of a feeling of uncomfort, of safety worries. And then you see this data sets, this global data sets saying, well, 100% of the citizens have access to electricity, which is not showing the fair, correct description of the situation.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you about your sort of your own personal response, your own emotional response to the kinds of issues that you're working with. Because, the things you've described, we're talking about levels of deprivation, people facing really serious problems, which I can imagine can be quite confronting sometimes. So maybe you can tell us how you're personally impacted by the work that you do.
Difficult to explain all the complexity of feelings. I think, let's say it's a strong motivation to work for me on this research to provide more insights and global awareness about inequalities, developing methods that provide data where data are missing and would be really relevant and impactful. But then, you often confronted also with like in areas where you're really shocked about living conditions. I remember like going with colleagues, visiting some of the communities along the lagoon in Lagos, in a very famous settlement, Makoko, which is underwater in the lagoon. And we visited one community which is basically living from dredging. And if we were standing there, and we were standing on just like a pile of waste, like the amount of waste I've never seen. So much waste in one space. Until they were explaining us that let's say this waste has a function. So they're extracting sand, which it's their base of income, and they fill, because else they would be flooded. So they fill with what is easily available, and it's waste.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in a way it's really shocking if you stand on piles, tons of waste, and you think about, of course, the environmental impacts. But then you also think about, it's like survival strategies.
Yeah.
Like people are very creative. But then, you're, let's say, another community we also visited at the same day actually in Lagos. We were all waking up one Saturday morning, and we got tons of text messages, images, because they themselves woke up. And they had the bulldozers in front of their houses, and they were evicted without warning.
Wow.
And we saw pictures of crying kids, women, men, losing all what they have, asking for help to everybody they knew, including us, because we have been working with them, with our local context. And that's really then emotional outburst. You see people and they're basically losing everything, and you feel very incapable of doing anything.
Yeah. Are you hopeful for the future?
I'm always hopeful. I'm hopeful. I think I'm more hopeful working with citizens on the ground than I would be seeing global trends.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so much energy and willingness, eagerness of learning. And that's, as a researcher / teacher, amazing. Let's say if you go to communities, what people are often saying, what they are most lacking is education and capacity. And having this sort of wish and openness to learn is really inspiring.
Yeah.
And that's basically I think one of my sources of positivism and thinking of that we can move on in a brighter future, even understanding that in the moment the global trends are
not looking great.
No. Yes.
I think that's a good note to end on. Monika, thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me.